Welcome to Middleweight Politics Political Analysis. For the independent voter, I am one half of your co-hosting duo, Dan Sally.
I'm Shawn Griffiths.
And if you are one of the majority of Americans who does not align with either major party, and if you are one of the majority of Americans who feels we need more than two parties, and if you are one of the majority of Americans who is tired with the options being presented by the two-party system, welcome to the starting line. Reform starts here. Now, America has spoken, and the 2024 election season has met a merciful end. Voters unhappy with the direction of the country decided the best solution to their problems was to re-elect Donald Trump to a second term, where a whole 50.4% of the country voted for him. Who says we're divided? We are going to dive into that, how the Democrats have played a role in the GOP's rightward shift, and how electoral reforms failed everywhere they went. Buckets and buckets of fail. But first, Shawn, I think before we get into the subject matter, I'd like to have a brief moment of silence for the folks at 538 and all the other polling aggregators who are just going to lose thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars in ad revenue with the end of this election season. I feel for them.
Oh yeah, my heart breaks.
Mm-hmm. Right?
Oh, one election cycle after another, the pollsters are either getting it very wrong or, they can only make the excuse of, well, we got it within the margin of error, right? It was within the margins, right? And at a certain point, we talk about the self-reflection that Democrats are having right now after this election. You have to look at pollsters. What self-reflection are they having?
One thing I would say is they weren't wrong. I mean, it was close, right?
Yeah.
And I think if you looked at the polls of Trump and Harris, either in any of the swing states or in the popular vote, there was always this sort of 5%-ish that just wasn't there. Mm-hmm. So it was never like one of them was 51% to 49% or, 50-50, whatever. It was always like 47 to 46% or something like that. And there was this amorphous group of people who either were undecided or just had decided on someone else. Right. And I think one of the interesting things I found about this election, first off, was how close it was. So 50.4% of the national popular vote went to Donald Trump. And even if you look within the swing states, I mean, he won Pennsylvania by a hair. He didn't break the 50% mark in either Wisconsin or Michigan. So this is the third election in a row where he has failed to win a majority of voters over in either of those states. So it's not a decisive victory.
Right.
And what I found interesting were the double haters. So I think we might have talked about this in an earlier episode, but when it was Biden and Trump, double haters were somewhere in the neighborhood of like 16 to 18%, right? Didn't like Biden, didn't like Trump. Mm-hmm. That number was about 8% once Harris entered the scene. And depending on which poll you look at, Trump went over the double haters from somewhere between like 15 and 25 points. So in my mind, you talk about the soul searching of the Democratic Party. I don't view it as a failure of Democratic campaigning or Democratic policies. I don't view it as a victory for Republican campaigning or Republican policies. I view it as a group of people who had strong negative feelings about both candidates deciding to break for the non-incumbent, which makes perfect sense given where the country is.
It's funny because my mother called me earlier today and she doesn't like Trump and she's not shy about admitting that she doesn't like Trump. And she was looking at the total turnout count, which is going to change in the coming days. California still has a lot of votes that still need to be counted. But she was looking at it and she was saying, well, there's like a 8 to 9 million vote disparity between the 2020 election and the 2024 election. And she said, when you look at Trump's vote count, it's not dissimilar from what it was in 2020. Harris was just down from Biden from 2020, and which I find very interesting. And she said what she liked about that was that it's not an indicator of people coming over to Trumpism.
No. What's really been supremely irritating over the last week has been just the hand wringing and finger pointing and postmortems about what went wrong with the Democrats. What went wrong? First off, incredible headwinds for any incumbent. We had inflation. We have a migrant crisis. We have instability abroad, right? None of those things help. Then you go ahead and nominate Grandpa Simpson to run again, right? He flames out predictably. And then you give his VP a whole 3 months to mount a presidential campaign. I mean, I don't see what could have possibly gone wrong with that. It went exactly as you would have expected. The fact it was so close says more about Trump as a candidate, because anybody else would have run away with that.
And I think it's also an indicator that as people are looking back and again talking about that soul searching, Harris didn't do much wrong in her campaign. And when I look back on it, I was like, in the 3 months she had, she ran a pretty good campaign. Now, could she have done some things differently? Yes. Could she have gone and done things like go on the Joe Rogan podcast? Sure, she could have done that. I don't know how much that would have moved the needle for her, but she could have done stuff like that. But considering that everything that she was able to accomplish in 3 months, I would say that the Democrats don't really have much to be upset about right now.
Yeah.
The thing that they have to be upset about, in my mind, is that their voters didn't really turn out in this election. And you could see this in the exit polling. There was an Edison Research polling that I did a short piece on that found that for the first time, self identified independents outnumbered one of the two major parties, and that was the Democrats for the first time. And so what the polling found was that it was 32% Democrat, 34% independent, and 34% Republican. So really, when you look at it, it's if the Democrats just showed up the way they did in 2020, this could have been a whole different story.
Well, and I think there are kind of two things at play here. Number one, we talked about this in the last episode. Harris had a choice between running on what she was going to do for Americans or making the election a referendum on Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And the referendum on Trump was probably a safe bet because a lot of people don't like Trump, right?
Right.
It failed. And Trump, whether you agree with his policies or not, had policies, right? He had policies. He's going to raise tariffs and do mass deportations, and he's going to cut taxes. And that at least, I think, gives voters a perception they're voting for something.
Right.
And in the current environment, where undecideds were going to the ballot box and trying to decide between two candidates they didn't like, they're going to vote against the state of affairs. They're going to vote against the status quo. I think that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah. When you're looking at two candidates you don't like, you vote for the person you think is going to bring the change to the status quo. A lot of people are looking at their personal finances, aren't happy about it, and so they look at two candidates they don't like. And currently, one of those candidates is in an administration where prices are higher right now.
Yeah.
The economy, by all metrics, is stronger than it was 3 years ago, and it, by all metrics, is getting stronger. But they personally don't see that. And I think the interesting thing to note about the independent vote in this Edison Research exit polling is that it was evenly split between Harris and Trump, almost. 50% went to Harris, 45% went to Trump, which means there's that 5% that's voting third party or other. But Trump actually gained 4 percentage points from 2020 based on what they found. Yeah. So a lot of the independents who were upset with him during his first term and voted for Biden in 2020, some of them may have swung back to him looking at, well, nothing's really changing for me under Biden either, while some may have just opted out to not vote. And I think there's also something to to look at there, because when you look at that 34% number, when most polling shows that independent ID falls anywhere between 40 to 50%. Gallup does this monthly poll all the time that shows where party affiliation's at. Now, the closer you get to election, it's going to drop. But Gallup, for the first time this year, had independent ID at a majority at 51% back in June, I believe it was. So if you're looking at a 34% turnout among independents, and that disparity, you have to ask, are independents really flexing their influence right now in presidential elections? And what would change if they did?
Amen. And I've been thinking about this over the past week, and even in listening to mainstream media's take on this, I think the issue I have is that there's a failure to frame the current situation correctly. And there's an
Mm-hmm.
analogy I was using that I think describes it perfectly, which is imagine like you're in a food court, right? And there are two restaurants. There's Long John Silver's and there's Little Caesars, right? I'm picking two of the crappiest fast food joints I can think of. So a bus comes up, 100 people. 51 of them go to Long John Silver's and 49 go to Little Caesars. Is Little Caesars like, man, should we start serving shrimp or like battered fish or something like that? Like, no, they're the only two choices. And the reality is, most of the people who got off that bus probably weren't that happy with either of them and probably got sick when they got on the bus afterwards, right?
And the sad reality is that some of them are choosing just to starve to death. So
Yes.
that's
Yes. And one more thing I want to say is the failure, I think, on the part of the media is for them to accurately report on the dissatisfaction most Americans have with both major parties and their
right.
dissatisfaction with their candidate choices, right? Because if they do that and they report on that, then all of a sudden it's not, should the Democrats become more like Republicans? Should the Republicans become more like Democrats? Like, maybe they ought to try to run for the majority of voters.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they ought to not try to be the least worst option. That'd be nice.
On a personal, I am a bit disappointed that my prediction was incorrect because
I know we got it all
before
on
this
tape
we
too.
made predictions, and I was like, I think the polls are underrepresenting Harris supporters, and that turned out not to be correct. But also, I'm going to tell you this: about 10, 12 years ago, I was running the numbers in elections in Texas, and
Mm-hmm.
just looking at population trends, I made a prediction that 2024 would be the first year that Democrats, if they were ever going to flip a statewide seat,
Mm-hmm.
would be the first year that they had a chance. And they actually did. And so I was a little bit like, oh, well, that would be a bit of bragging rights
Mm-hmm.
if if Colin Allred had pulled it off against Ted Cruz. But it didn't happen.
I felt the same way. My feeling was that voters wanted change, and Harris would be close enough.
Mm-hmm.
That's legitimately what I thought. I think the big problem I have is that in Trump's first term, there was enough ideological diversity within the Republican Party where some of his more impulsive moves were thwarted, right?
Mm-hmm.
You had enough establishment Republicans there to keep him from going full MAGA. The party is the MAGA movement now. The party is Donald Trump. He is the Republican Party at this point. And my question is, what is the second term going to look like? Where legally some of the brakes on the power of the presidency have been removed.
I too am concerned right now, and because I remember the first term, right?
Mm-hmm.
You and I, we remember the first term, and I think the overall concern is that there's a lot of people, due to just how quickly things cycle in the news, just how quickly they forget, and how quickly they may have forgotten what that first term looked like of his.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't support of a lot of his policies. One thing I will say is, in 4 years there will be a presidential election. I don't think people have to worry about there not being elections in this country. I think that there are. But the interesting thing for me, and while I'm concerned about what the next 4 years are going to look like, I'm also curious what happens to the Republican Party when Trump can no longer run for president.
Mm-hmm.
Who becomes the standard bearer? Trump has always been that he's the head of MAGA. He is MAGA. Well, who replaces him?
Well, and the interesting thing is that the MAGA movement is not as popular as Trump,
Mm-hmm.
and the 2022 midterms proved it.
Yeah.
Right? MAGA candidates flamed out during the 2022 midterms, and to be frank, there are MAGA candidates this time who failed. Kerry Lake in Arizona, probably prime example. And I think that the analogy I use for Trump and what he did to politics is it's almost like what Southwest Airlines did for airfare. I realize like I'm bringing a bunch of consumer brands into this episode. It's just kind of the way it's going. It wasn't intentional, but what Southwest Airlines did is they decided we're going to compete for bus passengers, right? We're not competing for airline passengers. We're competing for bus passengers. And so what happened is Southwest attracted a group of consumers who the airlines weren't targeting, and that was their base. And then they ate into the other airlines with their low fares. And so they managed to build this competitive edge by attracting a group of people who weren't typically attracted to air travel. Donald Trump did the same thing for politics.
Mm-hmm.
So my feeling is that the Trump voter is somebody who is coming into politics almost for entertainment. Like
Yeah.
Trump brings a show with him. And that show is designed to appeal to a certain group of people who probably won't show up to the polls otherwise. And so when Trump goes and when the Trump show goes, I personally think the MAGA movement goes with it. I don't think there's anybody who has his innate understanding of what an audience wants to hear. And I don't think there's anybody out there with that same type of charisma that he has. On the Republican side, I don't even think
Yeah.
his kids can't even pull it off.
I hope you're right, because it's a very dangerous and extreme movement, and I do think it does represent a minority of people. My concern, as you have kind of spoke to, and I've mentioned this in a previous episode, is that if Trump won, it would be an indication of just how serious Americans right now take politics. And I think Trump has created this kind of environment where a lot, like you were saying, a lot of voters aren't really taking it that seriously. My other concern is that at least for the next 4 years, things are going to get even more divided. And it's not just because of Trump's divisive rhetoric, but I already hear a lot of people, Democrats and independents who voted for Harris, who are like, if you voted for Trump, I'm not speaking to you. Like,
Yeah.
I don't want to be your friend. I don't want you in my space. Right. So, my concern is just how divided the country is going to get even more during the next 4 years.
Yeah. It's tough because people truly feel the stakes are high. And there was an interesting data point from some of the exit polling that came out, which was both parties feel democracy was either somewhat or very threatened. So 35% in the exit poll I looked at said it was somewhat threatened, 38% very threatened. That is almost 50-50 split between Trump and Harris voters. So 73% of voters, half of them Harris voters, half of them Trump voters, think democracy is threatened and
Mm-hmm.
think that the other side is that threat. There's another election that I want to talk about that touches on the issue of primaries, which we've talked about extensively, but also touches on the issue of whether MAGA exists without Trump or not. And that's the Senate election in Ohio,
Mm-hmm.
where Republican Bernie Moreno defeated incumbent Democrat Sherrod Brown. Now, the interesting thing is that Moreno is just the type of candidate who would have lost in 2022. And it was actually Democrats who bolstered his candidacy in the primary. So in the tail end of the Republican primary in Ohio, they spent $3 million in advertising to boost Marino's campaign, feeling that his views were going to be too extreme and that voters were going to reject him as they did other candidates in 2022, which I'll get to in a bit. Marino won with 50.2% of the vote. Brown came in a little over 46%, and then Libertarian Don Kissick took 3.4%, which I found really interesting. So Marino was arguably the most extreme of Republican contenders during the primary process, and Democrats pushed him in. So now we not only have a Republican majority in the Senate, but one of those Senate members is also more extreme than somebody who might have won if the Democrats hadn't tampered with the process.
Right.
And so I have a big problem with a party that tells me about the danger of MAGA conservatives and then at the same time tries to boost the odds that MAGA conservatives are going to make it into the general election.
Mm-hmm.
Because, the first Trump-like candidate who they thought didn't have a chance of winning was Trump. And it's a hell of a gamble to get wrong. And, they did this back in 2022 as well. So Don Bolduc of New Hampshire, Doug Mastriano of Pennsylvania. I think Doug Mastriano actually took at least one bus full of people down to the Capitol on January 6th. John Gibbs of Michigan. These are all very, very, very MAGA conservatives that the Democrats spent money on.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they all lost, but if they hadn't, we would have gotten what the Democrats have been telling us are the worst types of people to put in power. And I mean, I think it goes beyond just the promotion of MAGA candidates. David Valadao of California, who was one of the few House Republicans to vote in favor of impeaching Donald Trump, had this tactic used against him. And I think a lot of times when people on the left are like, why don't more Republicans stand up against Trump? It's like, well, then they've got no friends, right? Because the GOP is going to reject him, and Democrats are going to try their damnedest to flip their seat the next election cycle. So if you want more Republicans to stand up against Trump, you ought to start rewarding the ones who do, rather than trying to knock them out of office in the primaries.
Yeah, it's a very dangerous gamble for Democrats to do it, especially in battleground states. I mean, we saw, like you said, we saw this in Ohio. It's a strategy. It doesn't matter if it's a nonpartisan primary system or a partisan primary system. This has been a strategy for Democrats over the last few election cycles. Adam Schiff did the same thing in the U.S. Senate race in California to get Steve Garvey into the general election by running millions of dollars in ads, making it seem like Garvey was his main competition when Garvey could barely get a campaign off the ground. He didn't have any money. He didn't have any organization, but he was a pro-Trump Republican. He was a MAGA Republican. And it was a way for Adam Schiff to avoid having to go up against another Democrat. Because in a state like California, you're going to have a general election under a nonpartisan system that results in two Democrats getting into the general election. Because that's just how blue California is. And when you have even as much independent voters as California does, they tend to go more towards the Democrat than the Republican as well in a lot of cases. So, yeah, I think if Democrats want to learn anything from this, is that it may either be best to stay in your lane and let the Republican voters actually vote maybe for the more moderate candidate, or if you are going to try his tactic, maybe don't prop up the more extreme candidate. One dangerous thing I think this does, particularly for those of us who want to see things like primary reform, is that it just gives Republicans the ammunition they need to see they do try to interfere in our elections. Because one of the biggest arguments that Republicans have made in states like Ohio and Texas and West Virginia and other states for closing their primaries is this idea of crossover voting, that Democrats are going to come over and impact the outcome of the race with their vote, which research after research shows crossover voting doesn't happen.
Hmm.
it's as unlikely to happen as non-citizens voting, right? It's statistically just irrelevant. But in cases where crossover voting does happen, it's a result of someone wanting to go and vote for a candidate rather than against them. But
Hmm.
you know,
Well, and part of the reason Trump is in office is because of crossover voting. There were independents and even Democrats who voted in the Republican primary for Donald Trump in 2016. The states he did best in were open primary states. I think to get back to our food court analogy, Shawn, the problem is Little Caesars doesn't want people eating at Long John Silver's, and Long John Silver's doesn't want people eating at Little Caesars, right? But neither of them want a McDonald's opening up, or a Taco Bell, or a Cracker Barrel, or a Chipotle. Neither of them want to provide more selection to voters
right,
or patrons, right? They want to make sure your only two options are Long John Silver's or Little Caesars. That's it. Your only two options are red and are blue. And I think the issue that we're going to face in the next 4 years is that people are really voting for change. When people voted for Trump in 2016, they voted for change. When they voted for Biden in 2020, they voted for change. When they voted for Trump again in 2024, they're voting for change. And government is more and more non responsive. It's more and more unable to address the issues that we're facing. And it's going to come to a head.
and honestly, if you want to bring these people back to voting toward your interest in a future election, there's a lot of people, as we've talked about, who voted for Trump purely for personal financial reasons.
Mm-hmm.
They
Mm-hmm.
didn't vote for Trump because they agree with Trumpism. They voted for Trump because they don't like where their current situation's at,
Yeah.
and they don't see any other avenue for change other than to keep swapping their vote between two sides that aren't really doing that much to solve their problems.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you want to bring them back into the fold, if you will, or bring them back to really rallying for your causes, then shutting them out is not the way to do it. They're just gonna A lot of them are just going to entrench themselves further to where they're at.
Yeah. I think getting back to what I said earlier, neither party's going to address voter dissatisfaction.
Right.
Competition is going to be the thing that changes that, true political competition.
Right.
And to move on to the next segment of horrible stinging losses you and I experienced last week, pretty much every every statewide initiative for primary reform and ranked choice voting failed.
Yeah.
And you reported on this. Give me the rundown. What happened?
Yeah, so I'm going to stick with the three initiatives that combined ranked
Mm-hmm.
choice voting and primary reform just to start off with, because there were two measures that I predicted were going to pass. So I wasn't really expecting or predicting like a major sweep for reform this election cycle, just because of where some of these reforms were, like in deeply partisan states. So, like states like Idaho, Montana, and South Dakota, I didn't really expect those measures to pass just because of how heavily partisan those states can be. But the two measures that I did predict would pass, one was in DC, which did overwhelmingly. So there is some good news, right? It combined a semi open primary that opens the process up to independent voters with also ranked choice voting in all district elections. But then I also predicted that Prop 131 in Colorado would pass,
Mm-hmm.
and it did not. Um, Now, Prop 131 had a huge financial advantage in this cycle. And we're
Yeah.
talking millions of dollars going to ads for it. A September poll showed a majority of support for it, with even more leaning towards supporting it. Now, it's worth noting that this wasn't a poll commissioned by the campaign. that spearheaded Prop 131. So from that, there's going to be a little bit of bias in the results. But if, say, 56% say they are going to, it still looks favorable for you. And so going into election day, I predicted that it would be successful. Now, both major political parties in the state opposed Prop 131, which, to remind viewers, is the top four initiative, a nonpartisan top four primary in which all voters and candidates participate on a single ballot. The top four vote getters move on to the general election. And then voters would use ranked choice voting, which was a way for them to more fully express their opinions of the candidates, but also ensure a majority winner when there's four candidates on the November ballot. Both major parties opposed this measure. The party that was more actively opposed to it was the Democratic Party, which we discussed in the last episode, really is the party that has the most to lose from more competition and more choice in the elections process. But then there were also sort of weird no endorsements, like from the Denver Post, who didn't, the paper didn't have anything specifically against the reforms proposed,
Mm-hmm.
but it thought that the measure would lead to an increase in election denialism, which wasn't helped by Lauren Boebert, Republican Lauren Boebert, who said that ranked choice voting would lead to more rigged elections. So, in a way, they were correct. However, I have maintained that in the current era we're at, election denialism is here and it's not going anywhere. That's sort of Pandora's box that's been opened. But I think something specifically in Colorado that was noteworthy for me was the notable decrease in turnout compared to 2020. The 2020 presidential turnout in Colorado was 3.26 million voters, approximately. In 2024, that shrunk to 2.92 million. And now, in a presidential election cycle, you're going to have a little bit more voters vote in the top ticket than you are for things further down ballot like initiatives. It's worth noting that the margin of defeat for Prop 131 was 217,000 votes.
Hmm.
So when you look at the turnout between both presidential elections, you see a window where just the drop in turnout is what killed Prop 131.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question here, though, and tell me if I'm wrong. When I look at the movement in Colorado, when I look at it in Nevada, Idaho, Arizona, right? All the states where a top four primary system was on the ballot,
Mm-hmm.
I don't see a huge grassroots upswell of support. Am I wrong? Like, did this seem like a very top down campaign to you?
You are not incorrect to say that. And I will say one of my personal takeaways, specifically in Colorado, was yeah, you had this giant statewide organization that was spearheading the proposal, and they ran all these ads and stuff, millions of dollars worth of ads. But what you didn't really see was that grassroots on the ground bottom up approach to get this done. And I think one of the warning signs that reformers should take away from this election process in Colorado was a different story. The bulk of the money that went into the yes for 131 came from Colorado. It was either
Mm-hmm.
from Kent Theory, who was the sponsor, the main sponsor of Prop 131, or it was from Unite America, which is a reform group that's based in Denver. But in a lot of these states, whether it's Nevada, whether it's Arizona, Idaho, Montana, Alaska, the pro reform money is coming from out of state. So you're giving the parties this narrative that people outside our state want to change our elections. And so I think going forward, when reformers look at these losses, I think to your point about the grassroots thing, they need to realize that there is something to having a bottom up approach, especially when it comes to statewide reform.
I think one of the areas where the electoral reform movement really needs work is on voter education. Because
Mm-hmm.
right now, voters are being presented with this red versus blue binary. All the media, whether it's mainstream media, social media, podcasts, except for us, all geared around this team red versus team blue narrative.
Yeah.
And people are looking for a target for their dissatisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
They're broadly dissatisfied with Washington on the whole. And there are some who are definitely like red pill, blue pill folks. You're not going to win them. But my belief is there's a large group of purple people sitting in the middle.
Yeah.
Who really just need to understand that there is hope. Need to understand that it's not one party or one candidate that's going to solve things for you. It's really changing the system to deliver better candidates. And it can happen, but it takes time and it takes effort.
And to your point on voter education, and I know you're not necessarily a fan of the top two system in California, and even the reformers who passed it are saying now it's time to expand that reform. But I think one key takeaway that you could learn from why that proposition was so successful in 2010 was because the advocates for it concentrated all their effort on voter education, on this reaching voters through every medium possible to educate them on how the system is currently failing them and how a nonpartisan system could better serve their interests. Their entire thing was based on voter education, and they were obviously successful. And I think when you look at any reform effort, RCV in Maine, 2016, they focused a lot on voter education. They weren't just tossing out statewide ads, right? They weren't just spending millions of dollars on ads to try to persuade people. They were actually putting in the legwork. I remember writing an article 2 years later when they had to do the reform on repeal because the legislature had threatened to repeal RCV. And so they had to go back to the ballot to save it. It was a terrible winter. I remember writing about how you had all of these volunteers walking in negative degree temperatures, going door to door to get people to sign the petition to save ranked choice voting, right? That's the type of thing that's going to be successful. But also, in a state like Colorado, in a state like Arizona, you aren't going to be successful from the top down. You really have to build that support
Yep.
from individual areas, and I think there is room in Colorado, which is why I think turnout really failed them, because there's already 5, 6 cities in that state that use ranked choice voting or have approved ranked choice voting. So the foundation's there. Build from that foundation. But I mean, it wasn't all doom and gloom
Yeah.
for reform. Like I said, DC passed ranked choice voting in primaries, and then Arizona. In Arizona, voters rejected Prop 140, which would have ended party primaries, but they also rejected a measure that would have enshrined party primaries into the state constitution and also made things like ranked choice voting impossible for local communities to pass for themselves.
Mm.
So there's still a window there. And then you look at a state like Montana, where reform only failed by 2 percentage points. So I think there's hope for reformers to latch onto, and definitely some lessons to take away.
I think that's a hopeful message. And I think another hopeful message is that the next election cycle, voters will be guaranteed to be just as dissatisfied with their two options on the ballot. And so
Yeah.
there's still ample kindling for that fire. We are going to leave it there. Thank you for joining us. If you liked what you heard today, please consider rating this podcast, leaving it a review, and subscribing to it. And if you know other people who are dissatisfied with the red versus blue narrative that is consistently shoved down our throat and want real change, be sure to tell them about this podcast. this grows by word of mouth. Thank you again for listening to Middleweight Politics, and stay purple.